Hi, my name is Jim Cates, and I'm a psychologist. This is the first in a series of lectures on human development. This is actually an introduction, and I'll be giving an overview about human development and what we'll be talking about. I want to start with just a case vignette to give a sense of where we're going. Imagine for a moment you're babysitting Clark. Clark is 2.5 years old. You're getting ready to go to the park, which Clark loves, and you tell Clark to put on his shoes. Well, for Clark, shoes with laces are what he wants, no pull-ons for him. So he sits on the floor to pull on his shoes, and he tries to tie them. Now Clark is getting nowhere fast tying his own shoes, so you offer to help. Clark becomes indignant. He doesn't want help. He wants to tie his own shoes. So you let him go a little longer. He's still not getting his shoes tied. And you do the adult thing and use logic. Because after all, part of what we teach children is to be logical. And you say, let me help you get your shoes tied so that we can go to the park. But Clark still insists that he's going to do it himself. So you let him go a little longer, the shoes are still not getting tied, and you use another piece of adult logic and say, don't you want to go to the park? There's no answer. And so finally, you've made several suggestions to Clark about how you can help him, what can make this process go faster or go at all. Clark gets angry, takes his shoe off, throws it at you, falls over screaming and yells, no park, no park, no park. All right. How do we look at this interaction in terms of human development? Well, there's no single way, but to go back and begin to analyze it, the first thing we want to look at is who said what? What was the context of the interaction? And that gives us the framework to develop any kind of model or theory we're going to develop. Next, we want to know the why of this interaction. Why did it occur from both sides? And to cope with it, we need to understand the why. We see it from one way. We see it as an adult in a rational, logical form that makes sense to us as adults. Clark, in his 2-year-old brain, sees it another way. And from a 2-year-old's brain and 2-year-old rationality and logic, it still makes sense. But it makes sense from these differing contexts. And the interaction then has very different meanings depending on whether we're the adult or the child. So by observing meaning, we end up developing a theory. And as with any scientific inquiry, there are two primary components here. There's the observation, which we have to make to develop the theory. And at 2.5, there are a variety of developmental theories to explain this tantrum. Interestingly enough, at 12.5, there are also a variety of theories to explain a tantrum that destroys a classroom, but the behavior is left less firmly rooted in consistent causes. We have much more understanding, much more rationale for developmental theory when it's consistent with an age expectation, an environmental expectation. Once we move out of those things, once we're dealing with outliers whose developmental behavior is not consistent, we end up with much more fluid theories, much more inconsistent theories, much more dealing with pathology models which don't quite have the same consistency about why kids act as they do. Still, in studying human development, theories play an essential role. They shape our ideas about the meaning of behavior. They expand our understanding of the concept and potential of complex human functioning. because the seeds of independence that we're observing in Clark are going to grow into the complexity and the urge for independence and finding his own way that he's going to demonstrate as an adolescent, as an adult. They open the way to new research, and theories of human development guide interventions, which is especially important for school counselors, for therapists, for anyone trying to work with or intervene with children. There are many, many, many theories, but I want to consider 4 off the top that have been extremely influential. And they'll come up again and we'll discuss them in later lectures. But one of the first, just want to mention, is Jean Piaget, who came up with a theory of cognitive development. And for him, he was looking at the way children create meaning out of their experiences. So there was broad application for his theory in the design of age-appropriate curricula and learning environments. Sigmund Freud. Freud was one of the original creators of human developmental theory. We don't always think of it that way, but it's there. And his great contribution was the unconscious. One measure of his theory's value is that over the years, it has risen in favor, it has been dismissed, it's been rejected, it's been dismantled, but it has never, ever completely disappeared. And it gives us a way of thinking about the tension between strong motives or desires and the constraints against expressing these desires. So when you're 2.5 and you can't tie your shoes and you're frustrated, you just take off a shoe and chuck it at an adult and say, no park, no park, no park. And part of development is learning ways to handle that frustration that's more constrained. And Freudian theory gives us an idea, a model for how that process works. Albert Bandura, late 60s, early 70s, came up with the theory of social learning. And that led to the widespread use of the idea of modeling to characterize the social conditions under which children learn through observation and imitation. Up until that point, people had not really placed that much emphasis on how much children observed and imitated other behavior to come up with the learning they were doing. It stimulated much greater awareness of the social nature of learning across numerous contexts. And in particular, Bandura promoted the idea of self-efficacy as important in self-confidence, and said that efficacy came about through realizing that one could engage in the same behaviors one was seeing modeled. And that developed confidence. Erik Erikson was one of the pioneers whose psychosocial theory on identity as a theory of development covered the lifespan. Piaget, Bandura, Freud really looked at development occurring in infancy, childhood, on through perhaps adolescence, but at that point their theories really stop. Erik Erikson had psychosocial stages, or has psychosocial stages that go through the entire lifespan. Very, very different. And he sees a creative synthesis of a sense of self in society. And he believes this really begins to emerge in late adolescence and guides development across the entire lifespan. So we'll come back to these theories as well as others, but in doing so, I want you to consider the questions that need to be globally answered in exploring each theoretical approach. So some of these questions are are really very basic. First of all, what is human development? Well, a study of human development is going to focus on describing patterns of consistency and patterns of change across the lifetime. And it's going to identify the underlying processes that account for these patterns. And we have to look at both consistency and change, because some things do remain consistent. Some things in human behavior are consistent across time, regardless of culture, environment, social changes, whatever. Other things change dramatically, depending on culture, environment, society, whatever, as well as age. So we have to look at those two things and be able to say, what are the underlying processes that account for things staying the same? What are the underlying processes that account for change? And development implies a change that occurs over time and has a direction. The idea is that we're evolving as individuals. We go from simple to complex, less organized to coordinated, and less integrated to more integrated. For example, locomotion. Just take that very simple example. A child first learns to scoot and to crawl and to walk, and proceeds through increasingly sophisticated forms of movement and becomes gracefully bipedal. So, a child can ride a bike, can skateboard, can skate, not just walk. There are a number of talents that they demonstrate in ability to engage in locomotion. Development then is in some ways common. We're talking here about human development. All humans who have the physical capacity engage in locomotion and move through this process of developing. But it's not just physiological. It's ideas and experiences that influence the developmental process. So, all humans may reach the point where they walk, but whether they are biking or skating or dancing or how they're choosing to use locomotion will in part be based on cultural experiences and expectations. Right? Scholars who study development are also not only studying the process of development in others, they're progressing through that process themselves. So they watch what occurs either in themselves or in people close to them. For example, when I was getting my doctorate, my major professor was internationally recognized for his work with schizophrenia. He had a sister who had been diagnosed at an early age with schizophrenia, was unable to care for herself and was in some form of institutional care throughout her life. So across the years that he was becoming an international expert and became an international expert in schizophrenia, he was also living through the development of his sister from early 20s, I think late teens, early 20s, she was diagnosed, into her 40s and 50s. And that disease process and what it meant for her, socially, environmentally, culturally, and also physiologically, biologically, as she negotiated life and a lifespan with that disease process. So he was studying development for a person with schizophrenia, but was also living it through his sister at the same time. Humans are also capable of representational or symbolic thought, as well as behaviors. And I'm referring here to knowledge acquisition and use. I'm referring to imagination, to aspirations and plans, to cognitive awareness, to emotions, and to other mental activities. So, not only do we have all the physiological processes going on, but we have representational, symbolic thought. All of these things contribute to our environment and to our development and who we are. And that becomes a part of the process as well, these psychological processes. Humans have a comparatively long lifespan, and our abilities change dramatically across that lifespan. We have more and more people living to 100 years old. Think about how things have changed, just environmentally and socially, for someone who was born in the 1920s and is now alive in 2020 or beyond. The world is incredibly different. And the world they're living in and have lived through is incredibly different. So our abilities change as our environment changes, as our culture changes. We end up participating in a diverse range of social relationships, and we have to adapt to very diverse physical and social settings. And so theories have to address both constancy and change across a long period of time. And let me just back up for a second and talk about a basic question, which I know you've answered in other courses, but just to give you the foundation here so that we've discussed it. What is a theory? Well, a theory is a logical system of concepts that helps explain observations and contributes to the development of a body of knowledge. And we constantly use informal, intuitive theories to manage our lives. We more accurately call these hypotheses. We use hypotheses about the best way to avoid traffic, the best way to handle a situation at work, the best way to manage a situation in the family. If we're stuck in traffic and we have two possible routes and we think this route may be faster than that route, that's a hypothesis. And we act on that hypothesis and live our lives accordingly. So to be a formal scientific theory, though, rather than just acting out a hypothesis in daily life, it requires interconnected statements, definitions, and hypotheses which explain and interpret observations. So what are the components of a good theory, particularly a theory of human development? Well, the first is the domain. For example, whether we're talking about cognition, whether we're talking about learning, or whether we're talking about language, that will be the focus of explanation. And there's a range of applicability. Principles from one theory may have relevance in another area, but we need to understand the area of focus. It will also have assumptions. What does a theory assume about the scientific process, about human behavior, or about development? It will have key constructs, certain relationships or processes, and think of these as the key characters in the story. These are the essential characters without which the story wouldn't move forward. It'll have testable hypotheses. It'll have if-then links. And think of this as the plot of the story. What is the theory going to predict? So what are the requirements of a good theory? These are the components of a good theory. What are the requirements of a good theory? Well, first of all, it has to be logical and internally consistent. It has to be able to be explored through systematic research. It has to be parsimonious. It relies on as few assumptions and constructs and propositions as possible. The problem becomes parsimonious, quote unquote, is relative. When you look at Freudian theory, classic psychoanalysis, it is a complex, heavily crafted theory with lots and lots of constructs. So how parsimonious is it? Not very. When you look at Skinnerian or B.F. Skinner's work and behaviorism, it is extremely parsimonious. So some would say Freudian work is not parsimonious enough, and some would say behaviorism is too parsimonious. So somewhere in between, there's probably a balance. All right. What are the other requirements of a good theory? It adds a new level of understanding. And it does so by suggesting causal relationships and unifying diverse observations. It identifies the importance of events that might otherwise go unnoticed. And it's important to view any scientific theory as tentative and open to revision based on new observations. So what do we expect from a theory of human development? Where can we go? What do we expect? Well, theories of human development offer explanations regarding the origins and functions of human behavior and mental activity. They offer explanations for changes that can be expected under certain conditions, or from one period of life to the next. So this process of change, they're essential in offering this understanding of process of change. They explore not only how people change, but they explore constancy. How do they remain the same? And there are 6 primary questions that they should answer. First of all, what is the direction of change over the lifespan? If development isn't random, if we're not just helter-skelter creating a developmental process, what allows for optimal development? What are the processes we need to go through to really create optimal maturation and growth? And what mechanisms account for growth across the lifespan? And do these mechanisms vary across the lifespan? Is it the same mechanisms? Is it different mechanisms? How do we know? How relevant is early experience to later development? We know sometimes that it is. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. But there are 2 contrasting concepts that inform this question. One is canalization, the other is plasticity. And canalization means responsiveness. And simply it means whether at the neural or behavioral level. So whether we're talking about a very visceral kind of neurological response, or whether we're talking about at a behavioral level of response, the response is shaped and narrowed as the result of repeated experience. For example, we know that children who are raised in harsh environments are more highly sensitized to danger at a neurological and a hormonal level. So we know that children who are raised in war-torn countries, in war environments, we know that children who are physically abused, we know that children who are sexually abused, we know that children who are raised in homes where there's domestic violence are more likely to be sensitized to danger. The evidence is there for that. So they're more sensitive to danger. The cost becomes impaired physical health, poor concentration, and impaired self-regulation. That's the cost-benefit ratio there. Plasticity assumes the capacity for adaptive reorganization at the neurological, psychological, and behavioral levels. And that's the ability of humans to learn from experience and to adjust their behavior accordingly. So how do the environment and social context affect individual development? Well, human developmental theory provides ways of conceptualizing the context and highlighting which aspects of the context are most important in shaping the directions of growth, and what factors place a person at risk at specific periods of their lifespan. Well, we can look at risk factors that disrupt development. We can also look at resilience, the ability to adapt successfully to events that threaten optimal functioning. But even if we do so, even if we have a theory that is elegant and parsimonious and it describes all these things, what are the practical implications of the theory for prevention, intervention, or education? And that really is the big so what question. You have a great theory that explains a lot, but if it doesn't work in application, if it doesn't help with prevention, intervention, or education, the theory has very little utility. So we can explain a lot, but it doesn't help. Okay, what are the challenges to understanding human development across the lifespan? Well, the change in the person takes place in the context of a changing environment. There's very little that stays stable or the same anymore. New siblings are born, parents get older, socioeconomic changes occur, social norms change. Because the environment doesn't stand still, it's very difficult to parse development from the culture. And change is also both quantitative and qualitative. For example, take language. Vocabulary can be quantitatively measured. There's no difficulty measuring that really. From a baby's cooing and babbling sounds to the formation of first words, you can really measure fairly effectively the range of the vocabulary as the vocabulary increases, and measure how many words a child is beginning to use. That can be done. The problem becomes when you're looking at grammar and the use of sentences. So when we're starting out with very simple grammar, baby milk, daddy gone, two-word sentences, those are very simple and grammatically incorrect, but they're language, they're sentences, putting words together. But as a child develops skill with rules of grammar, it becomes a qualitative issue. We all know that there are very gifted writers, and the chances that I'm speaking to anybody who's a very gifted writer, and I'm not, is highly unlikely, but it's a qualitative difference. All of us, you listening to me talking, understand the rules of grammar and can apply them. But there's a qualitative difference between us and William Shakespeare, Mark Twain, on and on. So we get to a point where the qualitative differences are very difficult to measure. Right? Human development, then, is always going to be a product of the interaction of three dynamic systems. It's going to be biological, psychological, and societal. And each system is going to influence the other. And a theory can emphasize the influence of one over the other. But if it fails to account for all three and their interaction, it's not going to adequately represent human development. Human beings are conscious, reflective, and goal-directed. And evaluations of past experiences influence subsequent decisions. So considering all of that, each theoretical approach in this lecture series that we're going to discuss has strengths and weaknesses. And each theoretical approach that I describe is going to either click with you or you're going to think, I don't like it. Part of that will depend on your developmental experience and what seems to apply for you and what doesn't. But we'll examine these as we move forward across the lectures.